You can, with a stroke of a pen, end segregation in the armed forces. That was on July 25th, 1948. Harry Truman knew how to count. He would have lost New York, Illinois, Michigan, California if Henry Wallace had a strong following and could split the liberal vote, meaning that Tom Dewey, who was after all in those days a relatively liberal Republican, he wouldn't be in the Republican Party today. He was much too far left. But this is 1948, and it's a different Republican Party. And they would clearly have won in the states that would have supported the minority planks that voted in the Democratic Party. And with a split between progressives and regular party Democrats, he would lose the northern states. He'd already lost the southern states. They'd walked out on him. So he knew the only way he could possibly win that election was by signing that executive order. And on July 26th, within 24 hours, he signed that executive order. Well, that so impressed me, and I thought that you can really bring about fundamental social change through the use of the political parties and political systems. So I continued with Young Progressives for a little while, and I went back to the University of Chicago as part of the Young Progressives. And then I got into a battle with them because I thought they were being dictated to by persons who were members of the Communist Party. And there was a lot of hysteria about communists in America in those days. And I didn't want to be part of the anti-communist hysteria, but I didn't want to be part of the Communist Party agenda either. And so I quit Young Progressives and joined Americans for Democratic Action, and I got very much deeply involved in NAACP again, because I thought I wanted to make it very clear that I was deeply committed to the battles against discrimination, but I wasn't going to do it through the lens of a Communist Party. And I didn't want people to think that my quitting Young Progressives meant that I was anything but a progressive. So I got even more deeply involved in the NAA. But then NAACP was very disappointing to me, because I went to a convention, NAACP convention in Dayton, and Paul Robeson, who had been a lifetime member, he gave whatever hundreds of thousands of dollars in contributions that were necessary to have his life membership, and W.E.B. Du Bois, who had been a founding member of NAACP, was the editor of The Crisis, were each kicked out of NAACP. So I walked out also. I went to Columbia, wrote my master's thesis on race relations, and was invited back to Chicago to do a PhD in that field and work as an assistant to, or the assistant to Louis Wirth, who was a legend. He was the head of the American Council on Race Relations and chairman of the Committee on Education, Training and Research in Race Relations. But after a few months he dropped dead of a heart attack while delivering a speech in Buffalo, New York. So Herbert Bloom, well, I don't need to go into the details, over the next few months they wound up the work of the committee, and I couldn't write my thesis in that field any longer. So instead I was invited to write about gangs on the south side of Chicago. Because when I was at Columbia, I lived in a settlement house for my room and board on the Lower East Side of New York, and so I had a little bit of experience in that field and had written a bit about it. So I became a street club worker, as we called them in those days, working with gangs. Became a social worker instead of a sociologist. And became program director of a settlement house, and eventually went to run a program back in the Hyde Park Kenwood area where we developed an interracial community. And I was invited to join the staff of a newly formed Commission on Youth Welfare for my work with the gangs. And I was there when St. Clair Drake, who had been my mentor, a marvelous man, wrote Black Metropolis, and brilliant sociologist. He and I jointly formed the Chicago Freedom Action Committee. He was the president and I was the secretary-treasurer. And I had a big old house on the south side of Chicago by this time. It became the headquarters for CORE, with whom I still remained active. And this newly formed organization, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC. And I turned over the first floor of my, there's a 4-story house, townhouse. The whole first floor was turned over to Chicago Freedom Action Committee, CORE and SNCC. That's where I first met Martin Luther King when he came north to raise funds for the Stride for Freedom in Montgomery. And in the course of things, in May of 1961, I received a call from C.T. Vivian from Atlanta, I believe, in so many years. But C.T. called me in behalf of Dr. King. Martin had kept my name from when he had met me in Chicago, and the Freedom Riders had been beaten in Birmingham, firebombed in Anniston, attacked in Montgomery. And Jim Farmer, who had to pull out of the rides and go back to Baltimore where his father was in the hospital, wanted to call off the rides. He said he couldn't subject people to this violence. But Diane Nash, John Lewis, convinced Martin Luther King that he should help recruit people to sustain the freedom rides. Oh, Jim Lawson. Jim was probably the most powerful force. But Jim had trained all those wonderful people like Diane and John. And you probably know those stories. I don't need to go into them. But they needed recruits to help maintain the momentum of the freedom rides until the colleges would let out later in the month, so they would have students to carry on the struggle. Well, when I called back, C.T. put Martin Luther King on the phone, and there was no way I could say no to Martin. I mean, I'd been working in civil rights all these years, and I stupidly made some comment like, Wouldn't they see me as an outside agitator? And of course he said what exactly I knew he'd say, words to the effect that Dr. King said what I knew he would say, of course. And Mr. Fertig, none of us are free anywhere until all of us can be free everywhere. I was on the next plane to Atlanta, where I was met by Julian Bond, and he took me to where Diane Nash sat on top of a file cabinet. Never forgot it. And we went through a few chapters and verse of nonviolent direct action, and I was on the next bus from Atlanta to Montgomery.